At 2:01 in the morning, the lights went out across an entire capital city. Not because of a storm, not because of an accident, because somewhere else in the world, a financial decision had already been made. In the darkness of Caracas, a man was being removed from power. But what was really being seized was not a person. It was access to oil contracts, to refineries, to shipping routes, and to hundreds of billions of dollars locked underground. By sunrise, one question quietly echoed across global markets. If this can happen to Venezuela, what does ownership even mean anymore? Act 1. The night markets in Z at 2:01 a.m. on January 3, 2026. Military helicopters crossed into Venezuelan airspace. There was no announcement, no emergency broadcast, no warning to markets. Oil traders in Asia were asleep. American markets were closed. European trading desks had not yet opened. For several hours, the global financial system had no idea that one of the largest resource holders on Earth was about to lose its head of state. Inside a heavily guarded residence in Caracas, President Nicolas Maduro was asleep. Minutes later, he was in custody. Not after a war, not after a public uprising, not after an election, after a precision operation that lasted less time than a routine market halt. By morning, Venezuela's leadership structure had collapsed. And that is when the real countdown began. Because governments can fall in silence. But markets never stay quiet for long. The night markets didn't see at 2:01 a.m. on January 3, 2026. Military helicopters crossed into Venezuelan airspace. There was no announcement, no emergency broadcast, no warning to markets. Oil traders in Asia were asleep. American markets were closed. European trading desks had not yet opened. For several hours, the global financial system had no idea that one of the largest resource holders on Earth was about to lose its head of state. Inside a heavily guarded residence in Caracas, President Nicolas Maduro was asleep. Minutes later, he was in custody. Not after a war, not after a public uprising, not after an election. After a precision operation that lasted less time than a routine market halt. By morning, Venezuela's leadership structure had collapsed, and that is when the real countdown began. Because governments can fall in silence, but markets never stay quiet for long. Why leadership is a financial instrument in finance? Leadership is not symbolic. Presidents do not just give speeches. They sign documents, they approve resource contracts, they authorize nationalization laws. They negotiate sanctions. They restructure debt. One signature can move billions of dollars, sometimes trillions. Venezuela is not just a country on a map. It sits on more than 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than the United States. But here is the detail most people miss. Venezuelan oil is heavy crude. Decades ago, American refineries were designed specifically to process this type of oil. Not because it was cleaner, but because it was abundant and cheap. Without heavy crude, those refineries operate inefficiently. Margins shrink, costs rise, supply chains strain. This is not politics. It is engineering. And engineering problems always become financial problems. The origins of the locked vault to understand why pressure built for years. You have to go back. Venezuela's oil industry was once deeply integrated into global markets. Foreign companies operated fields. Capital flowed in, production scaled up, then came nationalization. Contracts were assets were seized. Foreign firms were pushed out or forced into minority roles. At first, revenue surged. Oil prices were high. Cash flooded in. But infrastructure requires reinvestment. Technology ages. Expertise leaves. Over time, production began to fall. Sanctions followed. Export channels narrowed. Debt piled up. By the early 2020s, Venezuela's oil output had collapsed from millions of barrels per day to barely one. Yet the reserves never disappeared. From a financial perspective, Venezuela became a paradox. A bankrupt state sitting on one of the largest untapped energy vaults on Earth, and global finance does not like locked vaults. The rise of pressure nobody saw as production collapsed. Something else happened quietly. Energy markets tightened. Geopolitical tensions rose. Supply chains fractured. Heavy crude became harder to replace. Refineries designed for it could not easily switch. Retrofitting costs billions. Shutting down costs even more. Meanwhile, Venezuela's oil stayed underground. Not destroyed, not depleted, just inaccessible. In finance, inaccessible assets are worse than missing assets. They distort pricing. They create inefficiencies. They invite pressure. Pressure builds slowly, then all at once. The breaking point, by late 2025, Venezuela's situation was unsustainable. Sanctions limited exports. Debt negotiations stalled. Infrastructure failures multiplied. From the outside, the country looked irrelevant to global markets. From the inside, it looked like a locked safe no one could open. This is where finance changes tone, because when assets are valuable enough, patience runs out. The operation that unfolded was officially framed as law enforcement. Indictments existed. Charges were real. Courts had issued warrants, but finance asks a different set of questions. If this was only about arresting one man, why disable a capital city's power grid? Why deploy over 100 aircraft? Why immediately discuss reopening oil investment afterward? These are not moral questions. They are balance sheet questions. The fall and the signal. By sunrise, the world woke up to the news. Leadership removed, control transferred. Negotiations hinted. Oil futures reacted before politicians did, because markets understand signals. And this signal was unmistakable. A sitting head of state had been removed without war, without a vote, and without international consensus. That changes risk models overnight. Political risk stops being theoretical. It becomes executable. Countries with strategic resources, weak militaries, and heavy sanctions suddenly look different to investors. So do alliances. So do contracts. So does sovereignty itself. The fallout nitrogen monoxide one admitted in the weeks that followed. Discussions began reopening oil fields, restructuring contracts, reintegrating supply chains. None of it was loud. None of it was celebrated. Because this was not about victory. It was about normalization. Markets adapted faster than diplomacy ever could. Energy flows adjusted. Refinery margins stabilized. Investors recalibrated risk. The operation was over. The precedent remained. Failed fixes and old illusions for decades. The global system believed sovereignty was absolute, that borders protected assets, that contracts were final, that leaders were untouchable without war. That illusion has been breaking for years. Debt crises override democracy. Sanctions resape economies. Capital moves where stability exists, not where flags fly. Venezuela was not an anomaly. It was a pattern completing itself. Modern parallels, the data confirms, look around the world. Resource-rich nations with fragile institutions face rising pressure. In the last 20 years, over 60% of resource-dependent states experienced external intervention tied to economic access. Energy infrastructure has become more valuable than territory. Shipping lanes matter more than capitals. Ownership is increasingly defined by control, not law. The data is not ideological, it is financial. The quiet fear nitrogen monoxide one says out loud the most dangerous part of what happened was not the helicopters. It was the message that control over assets may matter more than borders, that legality may follow power, not restrain it, and that markets adapt faster than morality ever can. This was not about left or right, not about America versus Venezuela. It was about something colder. When money decides leadership, no country is ever truly off the balance sheet. Conclusion: 3 takeaways. First, leadership is a financial instrument. Markets, price stability, access, and control, not speeches or ideology. Second, resources without access create pressure. Locked assets distort global systems and invite intervention. Third, sovereignty is being repriced, not abolished, but recalculated. The open question is not whether this will happen again. It is where and whether the world is ready to admit that ownership in the modern age is no longer guaranteed by borders alone. If this story made you rethink how power really works, stay with this channel, because the most important financial forces shaping our future are the ones nobody rings a bell for. Fade out.